you can't understand this as just a series of policy debates over individual things and whether or not we need to sort of tweak funding or anything. You have to understand it as a fundamental shift of worldviews. And the last time we saw major countries use the iron fist and the jackboot like this was in the fascist period. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing a complete disintegration of the idea that there is anything other than hard power.
The assault on the system, on constitutional government, on the civil rights order is very comprehensive. This is not a presidential transition that is trying to enact policy change. They're trying regime change. You fight this fight now because they are just demolishing the system, turning it into something very, very different. That's happening right now, and you need to fight back right now. You cannot wait this one out.
Welcome to episode 237 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. The Refuse Fascism podcast exposes and analyzes the threat we face, promotes efforts to defend people targeted by the fascists, and most essentially, challenge, mobilize, and inspire the non-fascist majority of people living in the United States to engage in determined, defiant collective action to defeat Trump and MAGA fascism. I want to thank our patrons who make the show possible. Join our community today for as little as $2 a month at patreon.com/refusefascism. Thanks to those sharing the show, everyone who buys our merch to support and spread the show. See the show notes to get your sticker packs and beanies that are back. And a special thank you to those who help the algorithms that help grow our audience by rating and reviewing the show on Apple Podcasts or their platform of choice. They boost the show so much. Here's one such review from a Canadian listener who reviewed us on Apple Podcasts. Water on Stone gave us 5 stars, titled their review The Best, thank you, and wrote, "There is no more important podcast in our time. Critical information, clear thinking, reality embracing analysis, consultations with people who committed themselves to deep study and action and who bring material knowledge and receipts to the table, offered from an ethic of care, justice, and mutual survival." Thanks so much, Water on Stone. And after listening, please follow Water on Stone's lead, share your thoughts to help others find this resource by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts or your listening platform of choice. In today's show, we'll be sharing 2 interviews. First, you'll hear from journalist Sasha Abramsky. Sasha and I focus our conversation on the centrality of dehumanization to Trumpism. Then we'll be sharing an interview with historian Thomas Zimmer, where Thomas provides a barometer of the fascist consolidation. Amidst the barrage of fascist carnage, we need to keep our eye on the big picture of fascists' attempt to consolidate power. Just this past week, they plowed ahead on dismantling all the basic functions of government that serve or protect actual people. They bulldozed and reoriented international alliance towards their hyper-predatory foreign policy while threatening a global surge of violence. They doubled down on attacks on trans people and immigrants in particular, while preparing to go after their other targets. They blew up the foundations of whole fields of science and medicine. Fascist-dominated states tried new and crazy things to feel out the limits of their power. They've committed to a politics of retribution, targeting anyone who has opposed them, and even everyone who has inconvenienced their ascent, effectively meaning the whole federal workforce. They are full-frontally attacking the rule of law. This is where we stand. Whether they succeed or not is yet to be determined. What we do in the face of this is yet to be determined. Tomorrow, President's Day, Monday, February 17th, we are calling on everyone, every person, every group who refuses to be complicit in a fascist America to take to the streets wherever you are, to come together, uniting all who can be united, to spread resistance throughout all of society, raising the slogan and declaring to the world, no, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept of fascist America. This past Tuesday, we held a Zoom forum discussing how only the people can defeat Trump's MAGA fascism. We worked together to get organized for the President's Day protests, February 17th. Here are two excerpts from Tuesday's program. First, you'll hear Paul Street presenting on what we confront in Trump 2.0. Then you'll hear an excerpt from Sansara Taylor's presentation.
In the name of humanity, we refuse a fascist America. We say in the name of all humanity, because the consolidation of fascism here in the U.S. imperial homeland will be catastrophic across the entire planet. We are further down the path of full fascist consolidation here than many Americans seem to know or want to acknowledge. A few brief comments on what we mean by fascism. The Refuse Fascism website defines the pathology, I think, very well. Fascism, our website says, is a qualitative change in how society is governed. It foments, relies on xenophobic nationalism, misogyny, racism, the aggressive reinstitution of oppressive traditional values. Fascist mobs and violence are unleashed. Fascism rules by decree, backed by brute force and violent thugs. Group after group is targeted along a trajectory that leads to horror. Fascism eliminates previously normative and traditional bourgeois electoral, parliamentary, and rule of law and democracy. And that's what the Trump 47 regime is trying to pull off right now in real time. As our flyer calling for mass protests next Monday says, immigrants are being demonized, rounded up. Blatant racism and anti-women, anti-LGBT hate is spewing forth. Civil rights and even speaking of equality are being banned. Whole countries are being threatened. Anti-science lunatics are being empowered to destroy healthcare. Media is being muzzled. Theocracy, Christian fundamentalist supremacy hammered into place. Rapid climate destruction is Trump's program. And here we might have added that fascist thugs are being literally unleashed, released from jail to intimidate those of us who refuse a fascist America. This is fascism. This is what Trump and his allies and operatives are trying to ram down the nation's throat in a many-sided policy blitzkrieg they hail as shock and awe. The speed, the multiplicity of these attacks is itself part of the fascism. It is meant to disorient, overwhelm, paralyze us, to render us speechless, demoralized, atomized, and powerless. Now, what do I mean when I say we're further on the path to consolidation than some people seem to know? Not to be too depressing, but Herr Donald has the executive branch again, this time with a popular vote victory few of us expected. He holds the Oval Office in defiance of the 14th Amendment, which supposedly bans insurrectionists from public office. He has a Christian fascist supermajority atop a Supreme Court that has granted him immunity from prosecution. His captive party, the Republic Fascists, control both houses of Congress. He's openly defying the independent power of the nation's legislative and judicial branches, threatening thereby to cancel the first and third articles of the U.S. Constitution. He's already engaging in blatant non-compliance with judicial orders. He's challenging the first section of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees citizenship to anyone born in the U.S. He's purging the executive branch of officials and civil servants he sees as insufficiently loyal and insufficiently aligned with fascist doctrine. He's eliminating references to climate change from federal websites. He's purging the Justice Department and FBI of officials and agents who dared to do their jobs and investigate his attempt to undermine and cancel the 2020 presidential election. He and his compliant party have put an open Christian white nationalist atop the Department of Defense. This new Pentagon chief, Pete Hegseth, is chomping at the bit to deploy the military against homeland protesters. So that's Republic Fascists atop the federal executive, legislative, and judicial branches and the military. And if that's not bad enough, they also control roughly half of the nation's 50 states. I'm speaking to you from Iowa, where it is legal to run over protesters in the streets, where teachers have been fired for telling the truth about slavery, and where you can be sent to prison now for 10 years for re-entering the state after previously having been deported from the United States. What's left? Trump has brought the capitalist social media and big tech kingpins to his side. I won't go into all the details on that. He has cowed leading media, news, and entertainment corporations from the Los Angeles Times to the Washington Post to CBS to ABC and to some of the leading film studios. Trump and his gang are taking aim at American education from K through PhD. And then there's the Democrats. They spent a couple weeks accurately calling Trump and Trumpism fascist right before the election, and then they haven't been saying the word much, if at all, ever since. They're making some resistant niche sounding types of noises lately, but we must beware of their basic orientation, which is to channel everything back into a right-tilted, money-dominated electoral process that has really pretty much become a plaything of the Republic fascist right. I worked for years in the Black community on Chicago's South Side, and one of the phrases I picked up from my colleagues there was, when you call something serious as a heart attack. Well, we've had some heart attacks against democracy and social justice that I've seen in my lifetime. I could go through a bunch of them. This one right now, I would say, is as serious as a potentially fatal and final heart attack for democracy, for decency, for social justice, for livable ecology, for everything good in the world, and even for life itself. A potentially fatal fascist heart attack, unless there is a serious mass movement quickly formed to make this country ungovernable, as long as our ruling class permits fascists to hold high state power.
We are a small group of people relative to what's needed, but a small group with a clear understanding who gets out and acts on what is right with boldness and courage and defiance, which is what we need to do on February 17th, raising that slogan, "In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America," can set off a dynamic, and we can learn and grow together to become the force, the only force that can defeat this Trump mega fascism, which is a profound movement of millions and millions rising up to create the kind of profound, undeniable, earth-shaking political crisis that the people are capable of, such that Trump really cannot govern this country and implement his fascist program. That and nothing less is what we are committing ourselves to do today, what we're calling on you to step into, and what we are launching on February 17th. A lot of people protest to make their voices heard to the elected officials. A lot of people protest to get people motivated to go, then channel their energy into the more realistic electoral arena 2 years down the road into the midterms. What Refuse Fascism is calling for, and what's required in this emergency situation, is something radically different. Protests that are aimed at modeling the courage and acting with the conviction and drawing the sharp dividing lines that wake up the decent people and tell them how to and that they need to, and give them a vehicle to step out of their comfort zone, off the sidelines and into the streets with us, and into mass resistance and refusal in every institution in society. Because every institution is being Nazified right now. It's the FBI is being purged. The schools are being told what they can teach and to not be able to teach the students. They want to have ICE raids come in and steal the kids, snatch them away and deport them. They want to have kids coming home with no parents left who've been disappeared. This is reaching and affecting everyone everywhere. And so our actions need to be in line with the emergency. And we need to be reaching and oriented towards, not towards those in power. Please listen. Those in power know that there's millions who hate this, and they don't give a damn. And they are bulldozing past people's will. Public opinion means nothing to them, but public action means a tremendous amount if we act together.
To watch the full forum, see the link to the YouTube in the show notes. Protests are taking place nationwide: in LA at City Hall steps at 3 p.m., in Austin at the Texas State Capitol at noon, in Chicago at Federal Plaza at noon, in New York City at Washington Square Park at 1 p.m., and in many other places. For the full list of protest locations for President's Day protests, to read the call for protests, to get printable leaflets and posters and more, visit refusefascism.org or see the link in the show notes. Now, here is my interview with Sasha Abramsky. I am really glad to get to welcome back to the show Sasha Abramsky. Sasha is the nation's Western correspondent. He is the author of several books. His latest, which we've discussed on the pod, is Chaos Comes Calling, the battle against the far-right takeover of small-town America. Welcome, Sasha. Thanks for coming back on.
Oh, it's good to be on the show again. Thanks for having me.
So in your recent Nation piece, you wrote something that really resonated with me. You wrote that the sadism is quite simply hiding in plain sight. It is also breathtaking. If I were a painting these days, I would be Edvard Munch's The Scream. And I wanted to just ask you, what do you think is being missed about the brutality of the demonization and dehumanization of people?
I think too many people and too much of the media is treating this as just a legitimate policy dispute. Trump says we're going to put immigrants into detention facilities in Guantanamo Bay, which was used for terrorism suspects after 9/11. And there's this whole sort of thing about whether or not it's legal, whether or not it's plausible, whether or not it's logistically possible, and so on. What's missed in that is, why would you want immigrants to be sent to Guantanamo Bay, which in the world's imagination is a place for the worst of the worst? The only reason you do that is because you want to dehumanize immigrants. You want to put a public narrative out there that immigrants are dangerous. Same thing with this idea of demonizing US aid workers. Well, I know that foreign aid is unpopular in America. It's unpopular because it's been demonized by the right for decades. But as a percentage of our national GDP, we give far less in aid than most other wealthy countries. So we're now going to give nothing in aid. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't just mean it's a legitimate policy dispute over whether or not a program survives. It means, as the New York Times actually reported yesterday, that people in the middle of medical trials, people who've been given experimental drugs, experimental implants, experimental vaccines, and have been told that there would be US doctors supervising them throughout that trial, suddenly are cut off A, from the medicines, or B, from a way of getting the implants out of their bodies. That's literally lethal. That's not hyperbole. It will literally kill huge numbers of people. But they happen to be people in poorer countries, in countries that tend to be non-white. So in the public imagination, they're easy to demonize or to discount. And we're seeing this time and again. Government officials are being demonized. Immigrants are being demonized. People overseas are being demonized. I don't even know how to describe it. You need a new language for it. There is this whole effort afoot now to remake the US government, which is the most powerful institution on earth, as a bully that bludgeons the most vulnerable people on earth. In my articles, what I've said is you can't understand this as just a series of policy debates over individual things and whether or not we need to sort of tweak funding or anything. You have to understand it as a fundamental shift of worldviews. And the last time we saw major countries use the iron fist and the jackboot like this was in the fascist period. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing a complete disintegration of the idea that there is anything other than hard power. Well, soft power has been a critical part of how America presents itself to the world under both Republican and Democratic administrations since World War II. It's been probably the most successful part of how America presents to the world. Now what we're saying to the world is, it's all about force. If you want our help, give us your minerals, give us your shipping lanes, give us your oil. It's a sort of smash and grab operation. And really, if you put Musk and Trump together and you try and understand this, it's the emergence of a very violent kleptocracy where there are no legal bars, there are no guardrails that hold, where Congress has sort of turned over and become supine, where all the investigative units of the DOJ that could investigate corruption are literally being dismantled. So there will be nothing left to stop a raiding of the public coffers by Musk, by Trump, and by all their acolytes. And more importantly, nothing left to stop a regime of corruption coming in, whereas if you want something, you pay for it. If you want aid militarily or humanitarian, you pay for it. If you want to deal with the government effectively domestically, you pay for it. If you want opt-out so that your business isn't targeted in immigration raids, you pay for it. Everything is going to be for sale under this administration. And that, again, is the hallmark of authoritarianism, whether you want to call it fascism or whether you want to call it a new thing for the TV, reality TV, social media age. Maybe we need a new ism for what it is. Maybe it's Muskism. But whatever it is, it's not democracy. And the sooner we understand that it's not democracy, the sooner we understand what's at stake, what's going to be lost as these unelected figures in the Doge units rampage through government. As soon as we understand that, we can start fighting back. But until we understand it, we're stuck. We're paralyzed. We're like the prey that's been injected by the venom by a spider before the spider eats us. And that is catastrophic for a democracy.
There were a few things that you said that I just wanted to lift up. One is the ability for people to see the violence that undergirds it, to look at the Doge purges, ransacking, however you want to see it. It's a lot of things all at once, but it's also an act of violence in terms of what the implications are. And I just appreciated that you were pointing out, yes, there's questions with all these things of, can they do it? How will they do it? But I think there's a really important question that you're pointing to is what's driving it and why are they doing it? And I just think that that's really important for people to come to grips with, because the more that you can recognize what's driving it and not see it as some kind of politically neutral concept that doesn't have the animating force of male supremacy, American supremacy, white supremacy that's really at the heart of it and that foments and relies on that hatred and that bigotry. I think the more that people are ready to be spotting it and calling it out, the better position they'll be in.
It's critically important that we do that and not just preaching to the choir. The consequences of slashing government programs are immediate. When you illegally cut funding mechanisms, which has been done over the past week, well, if you want to pay attention, there are stories out there of elderly people. I saw a story about a woman in West Virginia recently. Elderly woman needs dialysis, can't get dialysis this week because the federally funded organization that drove her to her dialysis suddenly lost all its money. There are stories of kids who can't get access to health care. Stories overseas of people who've suddenly lost access to HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, Ebola, Mpox, and all the other medical interventions that are needed to stop these diseases. Well, that's real lives being lost. Now, people keep saying, well, it's all going to come to a grinding halt when one of these 22-year-old hackers that Musk has employed to disrupt government presses the wrong button and Social Security payments stop or Medicare payments stop. Well, maybe it will come to that. Maybe there will literally be a collapse in the functioning of government that is so profound that even a 3 times Trump voter suddenly realizes, hey, things have gone off the rails. But before we get to that stage, let's have a bit of a discussion of humanity here. What does it mean when the government declares war on the most vulnerable people? When the government says, we are going to end Head Start programs, which overwhelmingly serves poor children? What does it mean when the government demonizes anybody who's transgender and says just gratuitously, we're going to put a transgendered person who identifies as female in a male prison? Well, everyone knows what's going to happen then. You do something like that, you are setting that person up to be beaten, to be raped, to be sexually humiliated. There's no mystery there. You only do that if you either don't care or if you want to terrify people. And this is happening again and again and again, that the government is setting in place policies that aren't just a little bit different, they are radically different because they turn the government into an enforcer of this, as you said, a sort of white supremacist, white nationalist, Christian nationalist vision in which a few people benefit and the overwhelming majority of Americans end up losing. They lose financially, they lose in terms of their access to the broader culture, they lose in terms of themselves being considered full citizens. That the more that this movement takes off, the more we redefine who is a true American and the more we limit who is a true American, the more we deal with violence against vulnerable people. And it's coming with a stamp that says made by the US government. Imagine that. Imagine state-sponsored purges and violence in what has been marketed as the greatest democracy in human history, which is why I've been saying in my articles, this isn't just marginally different. This is a historical tragedy. This is the kind of tragedy that happens once, maybe twice, 3 times in a century. But it is an absolutely vast historical tragedy that we're witnessing because it's America redefining itself as a state that relies on the iron fist. Well, we know exactly where that leads to. It leads to the death camps. It leads to the labor camps. It leads to the gulag. And it leads to the death of democracy. There's no mystery in this. There is time to mobilize an opposition. Trump's trying to sort of present this, and Musk is trying to present it as an inevitability. Nothing's inevitable. There is nothing in human history that's inevitable, but we're doing ourselves a huge disservice by rolling over supine and letting the Republicans and letting Trump and letting Musk do what they are currently doing.
I think one of the long-standing problems that has gotten us to this point where we have Trump 2.0 is the consistent underestimating of, to me, in my opinion, the enemy of humanity. And this is not where you're coming from, but it is a very common trend to only see him as the buffoon and to only see him as the idiot and to only see him as these things. Those people are not the people to blame, obviously. The fascists are to blame. But I do think that the more we can recognize the bothness of it, he is a buffoon and he's a fascist. He is not the smartest crayon in the crayon box, and he's also a masterful propagandist.
Exactly. And the two aren't contradictory. Here's a man who clearly is not a man of ideas. He doesn't read voraciously. He's not a philosopher. He's not a great intellect, but he is a superb tactician. He looks at people's weaknesses and he identifies how to sort of crowbar them open. He looks at people's fears and insecurities and he knows instantly how to exploit them. He is one of the most skilled demagogues in modern human history. Now, it's not an accolade, but it's reality. I'm under no illusion that all he is a buffoon. Go back 10 years, I was writing about Trump in 2015 in the primary season. There were other journalists out there, but I was certainly one of the first journalists on the national stage who was absolutely clear of the dangers of Trumpism and the dangers of the demagoguery that he was a master of. So I'm not trying to underestimate him. But what I am saying is we do ourselves a disservice when we assume that he has all the power in the universe, that between him and Musk, they're somehow supervillains or superheroes. Well, they're very nasty human beings. They've surrounded themselves with even nastier human beings. It's a rat bag of Nazis, white supremacists, rapists, sexual assaulters, kleptocrats. You can pick your epithet and they're going to be in the Trump administration. They've surrounded themselves with just foul, foul people. And those foul people are going to do a lot of damage over the next few years. But they aren't invincible. You know, I've been saying this a lot on Blue Sky recently because there's a lot of people out there who are really, really depressed. And, you know, I'm depressed too. You look at what's going on, it is heartbreaking. But I refuse to believe that the arc of history runs in the direction of Elon Musk and Donald Trump. I refuse to cede the moral ground to people who think it's a good thing to deprive the poorest human beings on earth of life-saving medicines. Every ounce of my moral being reacts against that. And, you know, I don't know how many people listen to this podcast. I hope, you know, a few people listen. If you are listening to this podcast, Trump and Musk want you to be disempowered. This is a shock and awe strategy designed to get you to think there is nothing that can be done. Don't believe it for a minute. There are a million things we can do. We can build community organizing from the grassroots up. We can form community safe spaces. We can work to try and fill in some of the gaps created by the void of federal policy around healthcare and everything else. It's going to be difficult. No doubt about it. It is going to be difficult. But these guys, in the long run, do not have the arc of history in their favor.
Thanks for that, Sasha. One of the key ideas driving, so-called conservatism for the better part of a century has been the notion of quote unquote small government, and obliterating whole agencies seems like it falls in line with that idea. But this idea of small government has almost always been largely a cover for changing not the size, but the character. Like not getting rid of government, but transforming it into a new type of government. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts that you could share on what are they working towards in that regard? What does their idea of governance look like?
There's no mystery here. It's actually a fairly straightforward project. They want government to basically be a security system. So government is going to have plenty of money for the military, plenty of money for surveillance, plenty of money for policing, plenty of money for building detention centers, and plenty of money for apprehending immigrants. What it is not going to have is plenty of money for education, plenty of money for healthcare, plenty of money for the environment, and all the other things that make a civil society function. So you're absolutely right. Grover Norquist in the Reagan era made a name for himself saying, we want to shrink government to the size that it's small enough that you can strangle it in the bathtub. Well, you can't strangle government in the bathtub, but you can strangle parts of government. So we're seeing that this week. Nobody's saying let's strangle the Pentagon. Even this crazy idea to send a buyout offer to all the CIA officers, which is one of the stupidest ideas I've ever heard in my life. But even that idea isn't designed to eradicate the security state. It was a gimmick. But if you want to look at what they are strangling in the bathtub, it's US aid, which gives money and gives resources and gives medicines to people in poor countries. It's Head Start, which gives educational access to poor kids in America. They're trying to go after food stamps, which nutritional assistance for tens of millions of low-income Americans. They want to convert Medicaid into a work program where you have to work to qualify for healthcare. Well, how barbaric is that? If you're sick, you can't work. That's kind of definitional. If you're really, really ill, you can't work because you need healthcare to get better to work. But now the Trump administration is saying, well, we don't really think that. We think if you're sick, you should have to work, otherwise you don't get healthcare access. Well, that's barbaric. It's also stupid. It's going to lead to epidemics and everything else. Who else are they going after? They're going after the CDC and the NIH because that provides data about public health that might prove to be politically inconvenient. There's a bird flu epidemic, which seems to be growing more and more likely by the day. You want that data. Except if you're the government and you're Donald Trump or you're Robert Kennedy, when you don't want that data because it might prove to be politically inconvenient and show your way of governing doesn't really work. So if you look at what they're doing, it's not a wholesale destruction of every aspect of government. It's a wholesale destruction of the social function of government. And it's a reimagining of government around the iron fist. Well, it's a completely, A, unworkable scenario, and B, unlovable scenario. Now, I know they want to sort of bully the rest of the world and saying, do it our way or else. But there's a lot of people out there. There's, about 8 billion people who aren't American in the world. And most of those 8 billion people right now are looking at this country and saying, hell no, there is no way on earth we want to go down the MAGA route in our country. Well, it doesn't matter how big the American military is. If the entire world looks at you in horror, you can't invade every country on earth to get your way. At some point, that breaks down. You can bully Canada, you can bully Denmark, all the things that Trump's doing at the moment. You can't bully the whole world, or you can try, but it's going to boomerang. And so I think, again, this project is messianic. This project has more than some similarities to the language and the behavior of the Third Reich. And I think a lot of columnists are starting to realize this and write about that. And in the end, millennial projects like that tend not to last very long. Hitler had an ambition for a 1,000-year Reich. It lasted 12 years. Well, that's not really 1,000 years, is it? And I suspect that Trump's messianic project, in the end, will be just as destructive.
I really appreciate that. And I do think that more connections are being made to that history, and that connection is being made both by journalists, but also just by people who are looking at this situation. And I think that's really important. As we close out the conversation and sticking on this theme of historical similarities, you had written recently about paramilitary forces and the January 6th perpetrators being pardoned. I was just thinking about a key component of Trump's January 6th strategy was for his violent minions to create such chaos that they would justify declaring martial law. And the chaos element has gone to radically new levels in these first few weeks of Trump's return to power. And I'm wondering how you see these violent paramilitary forces potentially playing into this.
Well, when you release violent paramilitaries, violent things happen. I mean, we've seen this already. Several of the people released have either been rearrested for other crimes, or I think at least one was in a shootout with the police. I mean, there's no mystery again. You don't release 1,500 violent paramilitaries unless you want a personal favor at the back end. You want to basically hold them in reserve. Like when he said to the Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. He's basically created a paramilitary force that's there if he needs it. But more importantly, he's symbolized a complete breakdown of the rule of law. I mean, when you release paramilitaries, you order the Justice Department to investigate anybody who was connected with investigating Trump's crimes or the January 6th crimes, and you scrub the historical record, which they're doing. They've completely eradicated all mention of the January 6th events in government documents. Well, that's Orwellian. I mean, it's a complete rewriting of history. We've never seen this in America, even in the McCarthy years. We've never seen a rewriting of history in the way that we're now seeing. We've never seen a purge of the career criminal justice system, of the career DOJ people, in the way we're seeing. We've seen individuals fired. We've seen in McCarthy loyalty tests, and you had to promise you weren't a communist or a socialist or anything else. But we're seeing now thousands of people being targeted for involvements in totally legitimate law enforcement and DOJ investigations. For people who claim to be protectors of the Constitution and believers in small government, this is rather stunning because it's completely unconstitutional and it has nothing to do with small government. It's to do with the worst kind of big government, authoritarian/totalitarian big government. I always think, well, surely there is no hypocrisy that Trump won't sort of stoop to. And then, there's something even more hypocritical. This paramilitary issue and the willingness of the GOP to completely and utterly abide by it is probably the most hypocritical thing in American political history. I mean, it is just in a league of its own.
I want to thank you, Sasha. And before we close out, I just wanted to give you an opportunity if there's anything that you think that people really need to be paying attention to, anything that you're paying attention to right now that you think people should be thinking a little bit more about.
I mean, look, I'm paying particular attention to the way that we're engaging with the rest of the world through USAID and other things, and the way that we're engaging with immigrants. Because to me, that is a litmus test of where we are as a society. We're a country that for more than 100 years has had a Statue of Liberty, which is basically our national symbol. And that Statue of Liberty has a very well-known Emma Lazarus poem about how we welcome poor people. We welcome people fleeing violence and poverty and everything else. Now our national symbol is going to be barbed wire fencing on the southern border, Guantanamo Bay, a high-security prison in El Salvador, and people in far-off regions of the world dying because they can't access drugs that were promised to them by USAID workers. That is a shattering change in how the world views us. And I don't think most Americans have even remotely begun to grapple with the consequences of that. But we have been a beacon. I mean, I hate quoting Ronald Reagan, but every so often it's worth it. We have been that shining light on a hill for an awfully long time. And replacing that shining light on a hill with the iron fist, that is a hell of a trade-off in exchange for cheaper eggs or whatever the hell Trump voters thought they were going to get. Not that there are cheaper eggs, because there are no eggs at the moment, but you know what I mean? I mean, it is such a tragic trade-off. And I think we're going to pay the costs in terms of our engagement with the world for an awfully long time because of this.
Yeah. In particular, I've been thinking a lot about Trump's statements around Gaza, that being the symbol of Trump Tower on the Gaza Strip being the legacy. I wanted to thank you, Sasha, so much for taking the time to help us understand what it is we're confronting, to share your expertise, your insights, your perspective. We're going to put a link to your author page for The Nation, a link to your latest Truth Out piece. Is there anywhere else that you want to direct people who want to connect more with you?
I'd love it if you could link to the publisher's page for my book, Chaos Comes Calling.
Perfect. You're on Blue Sky.
Yeah, just Sasha Abramsky.
Perfect. We'll include that as well. Thanks, Sasha.
Always a pleasure. Thanks again.
Next, you'll hear my interview with Thomas Zimmer. Today, I'm so glad to welcome back onto the show Thomas Zimmer. Thomas is a historian at Georgetown University, where his work focuses on the recent history of American democracy and its discontents, on the struggle over how much democracy and for whom there should be in America, and on anti-democratic tendencies and impulses on the American right since the 1950s. He is the co-host of the Is This Democracy podcast and has a Substack titled Democracy Americana. Welcome, Thomas. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks so much for having me back. It's been a while. I'm very glad to be back on the show.
While our topic is something that I'm not glad at all to be discussing, I am glad to be discussing it with you.
Like right now, every interview I do, every podcast I record, it's always the same. You would hope that some of the stuff that I work on wouldn't be quite so salient, and you never want to complain about people being interested in your work. But in my case, that tends to mean that we're not in a good spot, and a lot of people can see that. And so I'm glad we're having this conversation. I wish we had it under circumstances that weren't quite so bleak.
Yeah, I wish it wasn't so imminent, so dire. And in that way, I wish you more irrelevancy. As kind of related to what you were just saying, as much as you and I and a handful of others have been upsettingly correct in predicting much of what's happening, none of us can see the future. All we can do is identify the main threads being woven together right now, what's factoring into the situation. I want to keep it pretty open to start with. What trajectory do you see us on right now with the Trump regime having 3 weeks under its belt?
Maybe I want to just say quickly, because you said we were correct about our general assessment. It is true that I think anyone who's paid attention and anyone who's been serious about trying to grapple with what's been happening on the right should not be surprised by the fact that we're seeing something different than in 2017. This is very different from the first Trump administration. That is not to say that the first Trump administration wasn't bad, but this is just qualitatively something very, very different. And I think that in and of itself is not a surprise, because it had to be very clear to anyone who paid attention attention that the right has significantly radicalized over the past few years, and also that they would be better prepared. We all spent, I think, a lot of time over the past year or so, maybe even longer, trying to grapple with the sort of big planning operations that have been going on the right. So that is not a surprise. But I do want to say, I try to not play like savvy observer who saw it all coming. It's kind of like, I told you so, I saw it all come. How can you be surprised? No, look, let's be shocked by what is going on, because what is happening is, it's shocking. The speed, the radicalism, the scope of what is happening is shocking. I think that is beyond what most observers, even critical observers, thought. We knew it would be possible as kind of a worst case outcome, but I don't think many people saw this as kind of the most likely outcome or the median outcome, because I think it is really comprehensive. The assault on the system, on constitutional government, on the civil rights order is very comprehensive. It's coming from many different sort of angles all at the same time. And I think it's unprecedented. It's unprecedented in US history. And so I don't want to sit here and say, I knew exactly this was going to happen. Look how savvy I am. No, I'm shocked by what's going on. Again, not entirely surprised. I don't think we are, but shocked. And that matters because if it is the case, and I think it is, that this goes beyond what even, again, critical observers thought likely to happen, then that must mean something about how we sort of calibrate our expectations going forward. So we really need to discard any notion of, oh, it's not going to be that bad, they're not going to go that far. I mean, I think we have some pretty good evidence now that they will absolutely try. The question is, how far will they go with this and how successful will they be? That's still an open question. But there must not be any more sort of lingering doubt about their intentions and where they want to take us. I think that's now very, very clear. And I think in terms of like calibrating our expectations going forward, it is important that we allow ourselves to be shocked by this and calibrate our expectations of where this is all going. Because we are now in the midst of, I don't even know if this is still a constitutional crisis. 10 days ago, I would have said we're in the midst of a constitutional crisis, but I defined constitutional crisis as a situation in which the constitutional order is under threat and maybe sort of under a threat of being subverted. But if this regime can just completely ignore the separation of powers, can completely ignore the power of the purse of Congress, can completely ignore, just abolish agencies that had been established by laws passed by Congress, if that is actually where we are and they can get away with that, then we're not in a constitutional crisis anymore, because the constitutional order has then already been suspended. So then we're already past the constitutional crisis, and then we are in a situation in which the constitutional order has been suspended. So that is kind of where I see us, either still in the midst of a constitutional crisis or already beyond that.
And what factors do you see shaping that in the immediate sense? People are frequently talk about how, like, once a certain Rubicon's passed, you can't pull it back. Is there a way where it could be pulled back to the level of a constitutional crisis where there still is constitutional order?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest question right now, the one remaining red line is, are they, meaning sort of the Trumpist regime, are they going to completely ignore court orders and sort of judicial injunctions, or are they going to sort of respect them to some extent at least? That is where we are right now. If the constitutional order functioned the way it is supposed to function, then it would be up to Congress to actually rein this in and put up a fight against this unprecedented assertion of power from the president. But that's not happening, and we all know it's not happening because Republicans hold both houses of Congress, and so Congress isn't doing anything right now. So as of right now, in terms of like an actual putting up a fight, I hope we'll have sort of a broader mobilization of civil society also. But that hasn't really, at least not in terms of like mass protests, that hasn't happened yet. But what has happened is that the federal judiciary has tried to step in. So we've seen several court orders now declaring some of the initiatives of the Trump regime as just illegal or unconstitutional, putting a halt on some of the things they've been trying to do, suspending some of the presidential executive orders. So that has come on from several federal judges across the country. That's the big question now. I'm skeptical because, first of all, it's good that this is happening, right? So it's better this happens than it doesn't happen. The first one is obvious. I mean, this is now going to go up ultimately to the Supreme Court. Then we'll see what happens there. I don't think the Supreme Court will necessarily just greenlight absolutely everything they're trying to do, but it will probably greenlight a lot. That's the first thing. The second thing is the way the courts act, that this is necessarily reactive. They are reacting to what the Trumpist regime is doing. That means the Trumpists are creating facts on the ground. They're creating sort of a different reality on the ground while all the court stuff is happening. And then the third reason is that I think we've seen specifically over the past 24, 48 hours, leading voices on the Trumpist right are very clearly saying we're not going to respect court orders. We don't think we have to, because what they're basically saying is we represent the will of the people, like the quote unquote true people, and the courts have no right to stand in the way of the will of the people. What J.D. Vance came out and flat out said, we do not think we are constrained by laws and the Constitution because we represent the will of the people. And if that is the case, if they go through with that, well, then that is a big, fat, glowing red line into something just very, very different and fundamentally no longer constitutional government, democratic self-government. That is all out the window if that's where they're going.
Yeah, and the fact that, as you said, we're on the cusp of the regime most likely beginning to defy court orders. There's already the judge that says that they've already defied a court order. I'm wondering, what does it look like for people to understand? What does it look like? What happens once they are overtly defying the orders? What position does that put the regime in that they're not yet in now, or that they're not completely in now?
So this is a tricky question, because I think the answer is that for most people, everyday life doesn't change. For most people, everyday life just continues. And this is something that's frustrating, because I think most people don't quite understand how much it matters to have certain checks on power and certain rights that are just constitutional. I want to be clear. I don't think I have to convince anyone listening to us on this podcast that obviously we're not in like a fully realized, beautiful, egalitarian democracy that has never existed. That's not what we have. But we do have something, again, that I call constitutional government, meaning there are certain checks on power. There are certain rules of how power is being wielded and who gets to wield power and who gets to control power. And what's happening right now is that they are changing those rules. This is not a presidential transition that is trying to enact policy change. They're trying regime change. So they're trying to establish a completely different set of rules of who gets to wield power. And what they're trying to do is basically say, only us. And there's no legitimate institution, no legitimate sort of set of rules that can constrain our power, because our power embodies the will of the quote-unquote real America. And if that is the case, again, it doesn't mean that overnight you look out the window and you see a different country. That's just not how that works. But what it means is that fundamentally, right, they're trying to, redefine who belongs and who doesn't belong. They're trying to significantly narrow who gets to belong in this country. That would be fundamentally a more white Christian patriarchal kind of order. And if you are on board with that, you belong. And if you are not on board with that, you definitely don't get to belong as kind of an equal kind of participant in the political process. That's one thing that they're trying to do. And the second thing is that I think they would establish a place in which rules and restraints only are applied to people who are not part of the in-group, but not to the in-group. Basically, you would still have a security apparatus and the police and all that kind of stuff, but there wouldn't be any kind of constraints to their dominance, right? They would try to restore kind of dominance in all spheres of life. And if you want to do something about that, they would just say you can't, because the rules don't apply to us, but power and coercion applies to you. If you look like me, for people who are maybe just listening, I'm a straight cis white man, and you just don't have a big problem with Trump or whatever, and you just go through your everyday life. For someone like that, life wouldn't necessarily change very much. But if you dare to deviate from the order that they want to establish, if you dare to deviate from that kind of white Christian patriarchal order in which certain groups and certain people have a right to be at the top and define who gets to belong and define sort of the boundaries of what does and does not count as America, right? If you kind of deviate from that and you kind of object to that, well, then you get a sense of what it means to mobilize the coercive powers of the state against you. And I think that is kind of the society in which we would believe in, a kind of an authoritarian society that on some days you look out the windows and it looks normal, but on other days, and for anyone daring to deviate, it looks very, very different. And that's where we're going. There's no question that we are on a trajectory towards an authoritarian regime. Honestly, I don't quite care all that much what you ultimately want to label that thing, as long as you understand it's bad and it's dangerous and it's very clearly not democratic self-government.
I want to thank you for that breakdown. It was really, really helpful, and I think clarifying. People do need to understand that it's out of the normal. As someone who doesn't want to go back to what normal was, I can still say that we're not going back and that this is a radical departure. And I think that people being able to see it, this is power that would be both unchallenged and unchallengeable in a certain sense, because there's the evisceration of the means to protest. And yes, I'm talking about street protests, but I'm also talking about within the halls of power itself to oppose, this openly oppressive and repressive, and people understanding both aspects of that. I really appreciate what you were saying about it doesn't look the same for all people in their experience, and yet what's happening is the same. That is really important to recognize. I wanted to move the conversation a little bit to Musk. A lot of your writing on it, I thought, stood out to me as being somewhat different than what a lot of people are saying. You're providing a little bit more nuance, I think, that is helpful right now. A lot of folks have been framing what's happening now as a Musk coup, where Musk is in the driver's seat. And to be honest, I just think that's a convenient narrative. Let me be clear, listeners, I am not pro-Musk, okay? I just want to be very clear on that. But it is a convenient narrative, this wealthy foreigner deregulating his own business along with others, serving his personal interests. But what Musk is doing fits snugly, I think, into the overall ascent of fascism. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how you see the relationship between Musk and the assortment of other things going on.
There's a lot of things to say there. The first thing is, I think because the situation is so scary, it's frightening, and it's also complicated. I mean, so much is happening, right? The speed of which things are unfolding. There's a sense of, we're all longing for a sense of orientation and clarity. There is a tendency maybe to latch onto that one thing that's happening. If it were the case, this is actually just Musk doing his thing. This is the same playbook that he sort of applied at Twitter when he took over Twitter. And I think that gives people kind of a sense of security almost to say, I know the playbook. We saw this at Twitter, and so we know what's happening. It's just Musk, and forget everything else. So I understand that longing for a bit of clarity and orientation, but I think we need to resist that right now. You see this also, by the way, with latching onto the idea that maybe this is just exactly like Orban in Hungary, and that is the playbook. And that gives you a sense of, I know what's happening. I'm not confused. I got it. So I think we should not allow ourselves to just think this is that one thing, forget everything else. If you just look at Orban, for instance, I'm not saying it's not worth studying Orbanism, Orban is a very sort of popular figure on the American right, but Orban's authoritarian takeover of Hungary, the playbook there was what people call autocratic legalism. So it worked very much within the confines of the legal system and within sort of the confines of the constitution. And now you look at what's happening here. That's just not the case. I mean, the Trumpists are just all in on just blatantly, aggressively illegal, unconstitutional measures. And Orban didn't do that. And also, Orban didn't just give free rein to like a CEO king, feudal tech baron, right, to just go ham on the system. So it's different, and we need to see that. Now, with Musk, to me, the best way to make sense of what's happening right now is to grapple with the fact that the assault on the Constitution and on democratic government and on the civil rights order is coming from different MAGA factions all at the same time, from at least 4 different angles. There is the Project 2025 crew, broadly speaking, of reactionary elites and Christian nationalists who have kind of mostly aligned themselves with that heritage-led planning operation. That's Project 2025. And that plays a big role, definitely, 100%, right? But then there is also the America First nativists, the Stephen Miller, Steve Bannon wing of the MAGA coalition, who are in many ways aligned with Project 2025, but they have their own institutions. They're also ideologically coming from a slightly different bend, and they are behind the super aggressive push for like mass deportation, ending birthright citizenship, that sort of thing. The third angle is the tech right, the Silicon Valley, the feudal tech barons, the tech broligarchy, right? I mean, Musk is obviously the key figure from that. Yes, of course, they are aligned in many ways with the other factions, but they are also distinct factions, and there are tensions there. I mean, people will remember, I hope, that just a few weeks ago, we had what was dubbed as kind of the MAGA civil war between the MAGA nativists, the sort of Steve Bannon wing, and the tech broligarchs, because the fight was over work visas, because the MAGA nativists don't want work visas because work visas bring in brown people, and MAGA nativists are like, we don't want brown people in the country. They're flat outs of white nationalism, right? The Musk wing of the MAGA coalition, they do want work visas because that's cheap labor for them. And they don't care if that brings in a few brown people for a little while because, let's be clear, they are very racist, the tech broligarchs. but they think it's still good for them to bring in cheap labor for their sort of financial and business interests. There's some real tension there, right? They're not all the same. So that's the third faction. And then there's Trump and his sort of weird idiosyncrasies with his sort of weird thirst for a kind of politics of domination, both on the domestic level and then also on the international level. And I think one of the key questions going into this for anyone paying attention to the right was, okay, so these different factions, how are they going to function once they take power? Who is going to be in the driver's seat? Who's going to have to take a step back? Who's going to get everything they want? And who is going to not get everything they want? Because there are tensions. And now what's happened is that no one has taken a step back and they've been given the green light to go just berserk on the system all at the same time, given the green light to just go all in. And I think that leads to something that I would describe as chaotic but comprehensive. It's a bit chaotic because, I mean, there's some pretty good reporting that clearly indicates that there is not a lot of coordination between what Musk is doing right now and what Trump is doing, like, from the White House. Like, they don't talk to each other a lot. There's not a lot of coordination. Musk is just going ahead, bringing in his own people, like these tech goon boys, these Musk disciples, young men, 19 to 25. He's just bringing them in and they're going ham on these agencies. They're literally occupying these agencies. And yes, that does align with the broader, let's take over government and dismantle the parts of government we don't like and weaponize other parts of the government that we do like as a tool. Yes, it does align with this, but it's still Musk to some extent doing his own thing. And that is what is striking right now. All of these different MAGA factions, all been given the green light at the same time. And I think that explains some of the speed and the radicalism that we've seen, the dynamic that we've seen, this sort of destructive potential that is being unleashed. I think that's coming from the fact that rather than just enacting one master plan, quote unquote, just Project 2025, they're doing Project 2025, but they're also doing sort of the tech feudal baron fever dream, and they're also doing Stephen Miller's fever dream. They're doing it all at the same time. And I think that is where a lot of that dynamism and destructive potential is coming from right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you throw in the international dimension as well, it takes off. On one level, we know that one of Trump and Musk and Heritage's big goals that they do share is just to dissolve essential functions of the government, anything that provides care or service to people or anything that could act as a check to their power. But on another level, what they're doing with all these agencies, as you were saying, their strategic agenda. They want to destroy U.S. aid because their foreign policy vision is very transactional and they want all stick and no carrot. They want to destroy the Department of Education as it exists because they want to indoctrinate young people into quote unquote patriotic education, and down the list. How do you see this shock and awe campaign that you've kind of been talking about from these different angles feeding into their long-term plans? Do you see that continuing as a way to propel their plans?
I do not think that this is sustainable. You can't translate this. It unleashes an enormously destructive potential, but I don't think you can translate it into like a sustainable governing philosophy. It works really well right now because they're euphoric, because they are making progress. I mean, every day they're like occupying a new agency and they're taking over a new part of the government's information and financial infrastructure. So right now they're just going from success and victory to success and victory, and that probably feeling very powerful right now as kind of a successful insurgency movement, as which they see themselves. I mean, they call it kind of a counter-revolution, right? That's what they kind of dream of. We're doing a comprehensive counter-revolution. And I think right now they feel really good about their sort of revolutionary aspirations. But that won't last, right? There will be setbacks. At some point, they will run into some real trouble. Some of it might be unintended. Right now, Elon Musk has these like 19-year-old coders playing around with the Treasury's finance system. That is an absolute disaster waiting to happen. We're talking about just trillions and trillions of dollars that the system is moving. They have people with zero experience in anything really, but certainly not government. Like people whose only qualification is that they did an internship at Tesla or SpaceX or whatever. They finished high school last year, and now he has them go berserk on the Treasury's finances. It's absolutely crazy. I mean, think about these of disaster potential, right? What if that system breaks down and then all of a sudden the federal government isn't paying anything anymore? It's crazy. So there will be trouble at some point. And also they will remember that they don't agree on everything. There are different factions. The right is not sort of a monolithic bloc. There are different MAGA factions. One concrete example, and that I think is an interesting example. If you think about Project 2025, in many ways, Project 2025 was sort of starting from the diagnosis that we weren't ready in 2017. And so people will remember there was this sort of saying at the time that we saw a lot of malevolence tempered by incompetence. So a bunch of malevolent people, but constantly shooting themselves in the foot. And I think in many ways, Project 2025 was an attempt to shift the equation from malevolence tempered by incompetence to competently enacted malevolence. That's what they were trying to do. I just don't think putting a bunch of 20-year-old coders into the treasury departments and they brought their own mattresses and sofa beds and they play around with the payment system. That's not what that is. So I think someone like Russell Vought, who people will know, the guy who took over as director of OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, one of the key architects behind Project 2025, someone who's really dangerous because he's both very competent and also really, really radical ideologically. I think that guy looks at these Musk coders in the treasury and thinks, those are not the kinds of people that I want in that position. Part of Project 2025 was building this personnel database thing, a massive headhunting operation, basically, where they were vetting tens of thousands of people, ideologically vetting them and trying to make sure that they got an army of people who they themselves call conservative warriors ready to come in and put into those positions. But then Musk is just bringing in his own goon squad. Yes, they align a lot in terms of we're going to dismantle everything we don't like about government and we're going to sort of mobilize the coercive powers of the state against our enemies. But I think someone like Russell Vought is probably looking at this thinking, if I had a say, I would want some other people over there at the treasury and not that sort of 19-year-old goon squad. And so again, there is tension there. And at some point, there will be some kind of conflict. And at that point, again, this is not sustainable. I just don't think there's much solace in this because right now, this is unleashing just an enormously destructive potential. And I think by the time they remember that some of these people don't like each other very much and there's tension again and they start infighting and whatever, we might be left with the rubble of what they leave behind. So this is just not a situation in which you can just lean back and just wait to let it play out. This fight is now, and I wish we had a functioning opposition party that would understand this. They can't just sit this out, right? This is not something that you can just, maybe this is not the right fight. Maybe we shouldn't fight over USAID. Maybe we wait for something else. No, you fight this fight now because they are just demolishing the system, turning it into something very, very different. That's happening right now, and you need to fight back right now. You cannot wait this one out.
Thanks for that. As you were talking, I was like, well, you know what? We need to talk more about Russell Vought. And I wanted to talk about him by starting to talk about how he helps us understand who they see as their enemy. You spoke to some of the clash within that we can't rely on. They're not going to devour each other as we sit back and wait. When MAGA decries their ruling class enemies as radical leftists or Marxists or communists, it's quite obviously laughably delusional. But it does, I think, tell us about their vision, and I would call it a fascist vision. You wrote some about this. People should go read it. Profile of Russell Vought. And I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about how, by understanding him, we can understand who they see as the enemy.
Vought is really convinced, and I think some people want to sort of discard this because it sounds crazy and really extreme, but he really believes this, and a lot of people on the right really believe this. He really believes that over the past 100 years or so, a leftist revolution, sometimes he calls it Marxist, socialist, communist, doesn't matter. Like left-coded revolution has happened and has successfully happened in the United States of America. And the left has taken over, especially the government. He really believes in a sort of government-wide leftist sort of conspiracy and these sort of bureaucrats, these civil servants in these agencies and departments. He sees them as agents of a radical leftist anti-American conspiracy. And so in his understanding, the state, the government has been comprehensively been taken over by these leftists who made the state and the government into kind of a leftist power center from which the left has successfully, he says, demolished the constitutional order, subverted the constitutional order. So he truly believes that we are already in what he calls a post-constitutional moment. So he believes the Constitution has long been subverted and suspended by the left, by this supposedly successful leftist revolution. That is the ruling class. That's what he calls the ruling class, right? A leftist, left-coded ruling class of bureaucrats and leftist ideologues who have made the federal government and made sort of these agencies and departments their power center from which they are turning America into something it must never be and must never become, and away from what it is supposed to be, which in his understanding is kind of a white Christian patriarchal nation. And so he really believes this. That is why he is so focused on purging the government, purging these agencies, these departments, purging the civil service, because he really believes there's a government-wide leftist conspiracy. And I think what's so important about someone like Russell Vought is his idea of a post-constitutional situation really captures sort of the defining sensibility on the Trumpist right. They really believe that conservatism as a kind of conserving, preserving political project is just not good enough anymore. That was something you did as long as the constitutional order was still in place. But now that this leftist revolution has already happened, what you need is not conservatism, you need counter-revolution. That's where that sort of term comes from, right? As the leftist revolution has already happened, you now need a comprehensive counter-revolution. And it needs to start with taking back and taking over government and these government institutions, because that's what is sort of the leftist power center in America. It's bizarre in many ways, but it is truly where these people are. And that's why they constantly say things like conservatism is no longer enough. We have to stop calling ourselves conservatives. We need to be radical now. We need radicalism and not conservatism. And that's how they think about the world. That's how they think about government. That's why they're so focused on purging the government and taking over government, because they truly believe that is the leftist power center from which America is turned into, away from what they call the quote-unquote natural order of, again, defined by discriminatory hierarchies of race and gender and wealth and religion. That is what they call the natural order, and they believe there once was a constitutional order that manifested that natural order, and now that has been suspended and subverted by this leftist revolution, and so it's time for counter-revolution. He really believes that. I know he looks like the most boring kind of bureaucrat if you just look at the guy, but he's a committed ideologue. He really means this. He's not pretending. We really need to take this sort of ideological dimension of this seriously. This is a fundamentally ideologically defined and ideologically driven project.
I was thinking about when they say like DEI is everywhere in government, and what that means, that it means that it isn't segregated. They mean that there are women in positions of power, that there are LGBTQ people in positions of power, and people having to confront that, I know, can be very disconcerting. And then you look at this guy and he shows you that this notion still that there aren't true believers, that everyone's just a masterful marketer within the Trump orbit. He's proof. Him alone is proof. And I was wondering, now that he is back in his position, I guess, at OMB, what do you think we see next with these purges and the federal workforce?
They've already sort of reinstalled Schedule F. That was sort of initially a presidential executive order from very late in the first Trump administration, late 2020. Trump enacted a presidential executive order that was called Schedule F, that basically tried to convert thousands of civil service positions into political appointees. And that means you strip the job protections that come with civil service and you make them fireable so that you can fire them, or you can at least threaten them with firing them, right? Maybe you don't have to actually fire them, but this sort of hangs over them. They have reinstalled this. They haven't gone through with this yet because the Biden administration in the past year enacted some new rules that make it more difficult to enact Schedule F. And so this is one of those red lines that they haven't crossed yet. So right now they seem to be respecting the process of changing those rules back to where they actually can enact Schedule F. That will take them a while, a few months maybe. So that hasn't happened yet, although they have supplanted it by a kind of bullying campaign against federal workers, right? They basically sort of sending out kind of emails where they tell people, we're going to make your life difficult now and you should just resign. They're trying to sort of coerce people into mass resigning. They're also putting like thousands of people on administrative leave. So they're not firing them yet, but they're putting them on administrative leave. They are so far kind of playing around with these kind of purges. They haven't gone fully sort of berserk on this yet. What they haven't done yet is actually convert tens of thousands of civil service positions into political appointees. But they have found other, and I think this is a place where you can really see the difference to 2017, because that is really the handwriting of someone like Russell Vought, who understands, hey, there are other ways to exert pressure on federal employees and civil servants, and it's kind of creative. I don't mean this in like a normatively good, but it's a kind of creative way to make life really miserable for the federal workforce. They were just not ready in 2017 for any of this because they had no idea how any of this worked. And so now they do. Russell Vought really knows how this stuff works. So right now, I think they haven't fully enacted their most radical sort of purging attempts, but that is ultimately clearly 100% where Russell Vought wants to go. I mean, he has just, I think, was it yesterday when he just announced that he's just closing down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That is sort of the latest agency where he just sends out an email and says to all the people who work at this agency, he just said, well, don't come in, stop your work, don't do any work, you're out. It's like, that's it. It's fundamentally illegal, absolutely unconstitutional. Again, this was created by an act of Congress. Neither Russell Vought nor Elon Musk nor Donald Trump has any sort of right to do this, but they're just doing it. Honestly, Russell Vought just hates pluralistic democracy, just disdains the idea of sort of egalitarian pluralism. He is at war with pluralistic democracy. For him, that is so focused on the federal workforce. For him, that's the enemy. He really believes this, right? He looks at these federal workers and he sees the enemy because he thinks they're all part of a kind of leftist conspiracy, government-wide conspiracy. If we don't take that seriously as how they see the world and how they sort of define the problem and the enemy, then I don't think you have any chance of truly sort of understanding what is driving these people.
As per usual, the theocratic element of the regime has been going under the radar for many people, with respectable politicians and media avoiding anything that might seem like questioning the religious beliefs of Trump, Hegseth, Bondi, etc. Where is the theocratic element in all this? How does recognizing this drive for Christian supremacy give us a fuller picture of what's going on?
Look, Russell Vought is a self-avowed Christian nationalist, 100%. He found it after leaving the first Trump administration in early 2021. So he was already director of Office of Management and Budget towards the end of the first Trump administration. And then when he left, he founded the Center for Renewing America, like a think tank that is just explicitly, as its mission statement says, yeah, we want to inject Christian nationalism into Republican politics and conservative politics and into sort of the government. This guy couldn't be clearer about the fact that he thinks America is supposed to be and can only exist as a white Christian nation. All parts of that count, right? With the white and the Christian and the patriarchal, all these different elements count for him. I think what is interesting is certainly in terms of personnel decisions, we see slightly less of an influence of faith leaders in this administration, right? So that's quite interesting. So Trump hasn't elevated these sort of right-wing faith leaders to any kind of official position necessarily. But I think that only means that the broader Christian nationalism has so pervasively shaped all these plans, they don't even have to bring in some evangelical faith leader. So that is quite interesting. No, the Christian nationalism is really at the level of the Russell Voughts of this world, right? That is sort of the part where this guy couldn't be clear about. He explicitly calls himself a Christian nationalist, and he says, there's nothing wrong with Christian nationalism. Of course, we are a Christian nation. It is pervasively present. You saw this with Trump throughout the election campaign. He presented himself as a kind of Christ-like figure, persecuted supposedly by his enemies and sort of dying for our sins, something like this, right? He was constantly referring to sort of religious imagery and iconography. And in some way, I think it's gone from we're sort of elevating specific faith leaders to, no, this is just the underlying ideological grounding of this regime. And I think that's the point where we are.
Thanks for that. And then Vought isn't an anomaly in that. They're not hiding it. Hegseth isn't hiding it. Just because Democrats didn't challenge him specifically on the Christian nationalism didn't make him not a Christian nationalist. They're not hiding it. We've seen their campaign of retribution heating up within government circles, from investigating and suspending FBI agents and prosecutors who worked on January 6th to rescinding people's security clearances. As important as that is, do you see the retribution crossing the barrier from the public sector into just everyday people? Is that what's happening with the 60 Minutes lawsuit situation? How are you seeing it?
I think what they're trying to establish is sort of a pervasive, omnipresent kind of threat of, they're going to sue you, or they know they're going to come after you. I don't know where this is going necessarily, but I think what we've seen already so far is a kind of a self-mobilization of if you look at the business elites, right, they've very clearly decided it's just way easier for us to just go along and sort of actively support Trump, or at least obey and be complicit. I don't know where this is going. This is maybe what frightens me most. I don't know if that's true. A lot of things frighten me right now, but this is one of the things that really, I think, find really scary. So what's going to happen now? We're just 3 weeks into this. I mean, we're recording on Monday, so it's exactly 3 weeks. And they have opened with this just comprehensive, all-out assault on the constitutional order, on democratic self-government, on the civil rights order. And that leaves people who don't want that, people who prefer democratic self-government, that leaves us, broadly speaking, only two options. You can either just give in and accommodate, or you have to push back really hard, because a little bit of politics as usual is obviously not going to cut it. Even just a week ago, Democratic leaders in Congress were saying things like, oh, Congress needs to investigate. I mean, come stop it. Just don't be silly, right? Can we not be silly, please? So that's not going to cut it. For instance, I don't see how this can be reined in without a comprehensive sort of mobilization of civil society against this regime. But that, of course, creates very dangerous situations, right? Because it creates, for instance, situations in which we have large protests. And this regime has already said, and very clearly said, we're not going to have large protests. We are not going to allow that again. I mean, that is the biggest sort of lesson that they drew from specifically the George Floyd protests in the summer of 2020, is that they should not have allowed this to happen. They should have invoked the Insurrection Act. They should have deployed troops to suppress the protests. Russell Vought is 100% clear about this, that he wants to invoke the Insurrection Act. He wants to mobilize the military to suppress protests. Like 100%, like leaves zero doubt that this is what he wants to do. But that is a really dangerous situation, right? So you have a situation in which, as a civil society and as sort of a pro-democracy kind of camp in America, we are faced with the choice of either sort of complying and obeying and just accommodating and just accepting that we now live in a different regime, or pushing back and mobilizing, but then it leads to a situation in which the regime might actually go to a new level of escalation and really get very violent. It's scary, right? The thing is, there are no good options left on the table, because ideally you would want Congress to push back and the courts to push back, and we trust that we still have a functioning constitutional system in which this kind of just crazy, unprecedented assertion of power, of dictatorial power, is being reined in by the system. But that is not happening. It's fundamentally not happening. So we are now left with figuring out ways that are not politics as usual, but all those ways, at least potentially, lead to a confrontation with this regime. And again, that is scary. That is just an absolutely scary place to be in as a supposedly democratic society, where the only options left on the table are either accommodating or a kind of potentially really dangerous confrontation with the regime. But that's where we are right now.
And I think that there's violence either way by this regime coming into power, and the advances that they've made in consolidating thus far, even though it's not a fully consolidated fascist regime. We wouldn't be able to have this conversation if it was. The violence is what they put on the table. That's what their program is. And so either we're resigning to the violence that is grossly unspeakable. If their vision were to come true, what that would mean, what ethnic cleansing actually means in the most nuclear powered country in the world, it's true. It will take risk. It will take sacrifice. I personally think that there is possibility and there is potential. It is not inevitable that they will win, but it is pretty likely if we don't do shit.
I fundamentally agree that they will try. Not they will try. They are trying. They are trying. There can be no more doubt. Like, don't waste your time and energy on people who are still not clear about. No, they are trying. 100%. If we just let them, they'll succeed. There will be no epiphany. They will not wake up one morning and say, oh, maybe we shouldn't go that far. No, that's not going to happen. This sort of comprehensive assault on the system, on constitutional government and the civil rights order, it will either be stopped or it will succeed. That's clear. I think there's room for being creative. And I would hope that our sort of elected leaders in Congress and sort of the Democratic Party leaders just accept the fact that politics as usual is obviously not going to cut it. That is not a reaction and a response response that is commensurate with the problem. This assault, this crisis situation necessitates a bit of creativity in response and a bit of just accept what you're up against and then fight back. I think a lot of people, I know, certainly myself included, it is so disheartening to see there's sort of pinch points coming up where Democrats will have some kind of influence. In about a month from now, a little over 30 days, the government is running out of money. And so there will be spending bills will need to be passed. The debt ceiling will have to be raised. And Democrats at that point can say, well, not with us. We are not helping you in any way as long as you are demolishing the system. And instead, we have sort of Democratic leaders already signaling, yeah, maybe we'll help them raise the debt ceiling. What are you doing? What is this? That is so... It's so disheartening to see, maybe not surprising, but very disheartening. And I really, really hope that people, I think that is something that we can probably all do. We can at least try to put pressure on our elected officials to say, hey, listen, it's just not good enough. We deserve better. We need better right now. That still won't be enough. We still need, in addition, like a mobilization of civil society, a broader mobilization of civil society. But we can also hopefully tell our elected leaders who are nominally tasked with defending the democratic system to just put up a fight, please. Yes, because we really deserve better.
Thomas, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, to share your insights, your expertise, your perspective. I want to give you an opportunity to let people know the best places to connect with you.
I'm mostly on Blue Sky these days, where you'll find me under my name. It's @Thomas Zimmer. And then I write a newsletter that's called Democracy Americana that is trying to grapple with sort of a big picture perspective on what's unfolding in this country and in this sort of struggle over democracy in this country. And I host a podcast that is called Is This Democracy? I know right now it can be overwhelming for a lot of people, but I certainly appreciate anyone spending time and energy with me as we're all trying to grapple with what's unfolding around us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. Take to the streets tomorrow. Join protests this President's Day nationwide, raising and acting on the slogan, "No, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America." For protest locations, organizing materials, and more, visit refusefascism.org or see the show notes. Be sure to tag us in your pictures and videos from the protests. Want to support the show? Spread the imperative and support the show by getting merch like Refuse Fascism beanies, sticker packs, and t-shirts. See the show notes to get yours today. Join our Patreon community to fuel mass refusal of this fascist nightmare. Visit patreon.com/refusefascism. And for $0, share this show with others. Rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, or comment on our socials or YouTube. It makes a difference and is so appreciated. Connect with us on social media @refusefascism, including on Blue Sky, and find me on TikTok @SamGoldmanRF. This movement to defeat Trump and MAGA fascism needs you, your talents, your creativity, your professional skills. Contribute them today. Sign up to volunteer. Visit refusefascism.org/volunteer2025 or see the show notes. As always, thanks to Richie Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tinkelman for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers, we have transcripts available for each show. So be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.